Hey, it's Lou, and some wild shit is going down in Ethiopia. Over the last decade, the African nation has lost 21 points on its freedom score, a well-respected measure of a country's civil liberties and political rights. It's no wonder. Ethnic tensions and economic inequality have led to widespread protests, which were met with government violence. Thousands of demonstrators have been detained or killed. Opposition groups that challenged the country's ruling coalition were officially labeled terrorists. But a new Ethiopian prime minister, the youngest head of state on the continent, has upended the repressive dynamic, ushering in reforms and unclinching the government's iron fist. He's even ended Africa's longest war. Yet, the question remains, is the region just flirting with good governance, or will peace and prosperity finally emerge in the Horn of Africa? Since 1991, when a brutal socialist regime was toppled, a single political coalition has ruled Ethiopia. That's the EPRDF. Political scientist Sandra Joireman, an Africa expert at the University of Richmond, told me the EPRDF claims they oversee a democracy, but most of the world sees the country as an autocratic one-party regime. Power is maintained by intimidating political opponents, rigging elections, and outlawing the free press and public assembly. They get away with it, to a certain degree at least, because the Ethiopian economy has been improving. Yet, Dessu, an analyst at the Institute for Security Studies, told me two recent issues exacerbated discontent within Ethiopia. The first is a bit ironic. The EPRDF invested a lot of money in the education system, growing the number of universities from 2 at the turn of the century to about 30. This has created millions of recent college graduates. The median age in Ethiopia, astonishingly, is 18. So there are all these young people with degrees and high expectations that can't find a job befitting of a college graduate. Educating folks has not created a proportionate number of opportunities. Second issue, Marissa told me the government has prioritized urbanization. They seized farmland outside the capital city, Addis Ababa, to expand its size. But they did not fairly compensate the farmers, most of whom were Oromo. That's the largest ethnicity in Ethiopia. This played into long-standing ethnic tensions. The Oromo, despite their size, have very little political power and have long felt marginalized by the Tigrayan people who've dominated government. All these issues and others fomented into widespread protests. To stop the growing discontent, the government declared a state of emergency in October 2016. Free speech was effectively banned. The internet was censored or sometimes completely blocked. Worse, Human Rights Watch reports 21,000 people were arbitrarily detained and another 1,000 were killed. The state of emergency was lifted in August 2017, but a second one was imposed when the prime minister resigned in February 2018. Enter into this scene the new prime minister, a young, charismatic guy named Abiy Ahmed. Abiy was a powerful member of the EPRDF coalition for 2 decades. That's why they elevated him to the highest position in the country. But importantly, he's an Oromo. He's part of that ethnic group that's felt repressed, and he's pro-reform. In one of his first speeches in office, he declared, "This is the season in which we learn from our mistakes and compensate our country." Abiy ends the state of emergency. He frees thousands of political prisoners and declassifies opposition groups as terrorist organizations. He fires controversial officials, he lifts the ban on websites and other media critical of the government, and to help with economic woes, he suggests selling off parts of state-controlled companies. Perhaps most surprisingly, he ends a 20-year war with Ethiopia's neighbor, that's Eritrea. Okay, a very quick history lesson here. Eritrea was once part of the Ethiopian Empire, but it got colonized by Italy in the 1860s. Following World War II, the UN merged Ethiopia and Eritrea, but Eritrea was supposed to maintain a great deal of autonomy. It didn't. Ethiopia claimed it as a province. There was a long fight for independence, a lot of bloodshed, but eventually, Ethiopians and Eritreans realized they had a common enemy, the socialist military junta ruling the region. So, they come together, push the socialists out. The two countries kind of go their separate ways, but tensions emerge about monetary policy and trade and who's a citizen of which country and a bunch of other stuff. Eventually, there's a dispute about what the border is between the two countries and who gets to farm it. A war breaks out in 1998. Eventually, some 70,000 people die in this war. Different international organizations try to resolve the dispute over the border. There's even an agreement in principle, but politics get in the way. The two countries' leaders have a bit of a personal rivalry. Plus, the conflict gets tied up with feelings about nationalism and pride and strength. Communication and economic activity is cut off. The hostility drags on for 20 years. Now, it's not like there's full-blown combat at all times, but there are occasional skirmishes, and both sides spend a lot of money, which is in tight supply in the region, defending their territory. Maressa said for the majority of those 2 decades, there was no war, but there certainly was no peace either. And then Abiy comes to power with a fresh perspective, and he says, let's end this. We had a peace agreement in 2000 that never got executed. I'll accept those terms. The terms, by the way, pretty clearly favored Eritrea. Professor Terence Lyons, a conflict analysis expert at George Mason University, told me Ethiopia's old guard might have refused to capitulate because they started the conflict and wanted to save face. They didn't want to give up. But Abiy didn't have the same political baggage. Plus, the United Arab Emirates started investing in the region, and they wanted to bring both sides towards a resolution. So, a peace agreement is signed on July 9th, 2018. The metaphorical wall between the two countries comes down. Family members and friends who weren't even allowed to call each other can suddenly reconnect. One man is reunited with his daughters after 16 years apart. Passenger planes are allowed to travel between the two countries. On the first flight, roses and champagne are distributed. The countries reestablished diplomatic ties. The BBC took photographs as the Ethiopian embassy reopened in Eritrea. Shuttered for 2 decades, all the furniture was covered in dust. A 20-year-old case of beer sat unopened. Meanwhile, Ethiopia now has access to Eritrea's ports, a huge economic advantage. Trade will benefit both countries. So optimism abounds. The jubilation on social media and in the streets is teeming. One person compared the peace agreement to the fall of the Berlin Wall. But issues still remain. Abiy is a reformer, but he's a member of that coalition that controls 100% of parliament. That's been accused of terrifying human rights abuses, political bullying, favoring the elite, and a bit of corruption. Will he move the country towards democracy when the next election comes in 2020? Can he get those Freedom House points back and then some? Meanwhile, Eritrea, well, Freedom House gives them the 3rd lowest freedom score in the world, tied with North Korea. The country, one of the planet's poorest, is a full-blown dictatorship. The government in Eritrea murders and kidnaps. Men and women are forced to join the army for an indefinite period of time. UN investigators say the compulsory military service can be classified as enslavement and commonly entails sexual violence and torture. Joireman also reminded me that the entire region is very dependent on rain-fed agriculture in a time of both climate change and population explosion. So yeah, not a completely rosy picture, but there is some hope peeking through. Maressa told me the peace agreement in particular could bring stability to the entire Horn of Africa. Let's hope so. And let's hope leaders who've long manipulated the levers of power to their advantage finally start prioritizing their countrymen over themselves. Hey, so quick update here. We recorded this piece just about a week ago, and some things have developed since then. Reports indicate that Eritrea has told its newest military recruits that the indefinite military service requirement is getting phased out. And in a speech to opposition groups, Abiy said Ethiopia has, quote, no option except pursuing a multi-party democracy supported by strong institutions that respect human rights and rule of law. So all the right things are being said. We just got to see how it plays out.